Director here at the Women in Public Policy Program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our seminar. Mariko Chang is joining us today, and she is presenting on her new work, Short Change, Understanding the Women's Wealth Gap. She has a book by almost the same title, with the subtitle, Why Women Have Less Wealth and What Can Be Done About It. Mariko is no stranger to Harvard. She was here at the Sociology Department from 1998 until 2007. She has worked extensively both on this topic, doing original research, looking at the wealth gap and trying to understand it particularly not just for women, but for minorities. And in addition, one of the things that she does is she is now an independent consultant and works with universities looking at disparities in gender balance and other types of diversity issues among the faculty. She's done this extensively and is actually collegiate with one of our longtime fellows, Alice Hogan, who works on the Advance Project from the National Science Foundation, which is geared at exactly looking at pathways and interventions to help make faculties more diverse in the areas of the sciences. I want to tell you a couple more things about Mariko Chang's background. She has her PhD from Stanford University. She's the main author of a report that came out last spring, Lifting as We Climb, Women of Color, Wealth, and America's Future. And she's co-author of the recent report, At Rope's End, Single Women Mothers, Wealth, and Assets in the U.S. We are thrilled that you're with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I love to talk to people about this topic. I think it's so important, and critical for women and for men to understand the roots of the women's wealth gap. So we're used to thinking, is the microphone on? It is on?
It is.
Okay. So we're used to thinking about women's economic status primarily in terms of income, or how much money comes into a household over a period of time, such as a year. So common forms of income would include money from salary or wages, retirement income, Social Security benefits. Essentially anything that comes into your pocket or wallet or purse is income. But I'm going to encourage us to move beyond income to also look at wealth. And wealth here is net worth, or the value of your assets minus your debts at a single point in time. So what do I mean by assets and debts? Well, assets would include things like money that you have in checkings or savings accounts, any real estate that you might own, money in retirement accounts, business assets. So essentially anything of significant value that can be sold or is already in cash form. Liabilities, some very common ones include mortgage debt, credit card debt, and any type of loans. So we add up all the assets, we subtract the liabilities, and you end up with your wealth. And wealth can be negative. So why do we care about wealth? Why should we look at wealth in addition to or instead of income? Well, the first reason is that wealth inequality is so much greater than income inequality in the United States. You might have seen some recent press coverage on this issue, but just to give you an example, the top 1% of the population earns collectively about 21% of the total income, but they own more than a third of the total wealth. So the top 1% owns 35% of all of the wealth in the United States. Contrasting to that, the bottom 60%, and that's 60, not 6, also own collectively about 21% of the income, but together they own just 1% of the total wealth. So the disparities are far, far greater when we look at wealth. But also, having wealth is different from having income because wealth actually offers you benefits that income doesn't. So for example, you can generate further income from wealth, interest or rents, for example. Wealth can also be used as collateral for loans. This is really important if you're trying to take out a loan for a small business, if you're trying to borrow money to send your child to college, for instance. Wealth is also passed down from generation to generation, and this is a really critical factor when we're looking at the racial wealth gap, because any inequities from prior generations continue to translate to future generations. So the intergenerational transfer of wealth is actually one of the reasons why we see this tremendous and persistent racial wealth gap. But also, as the economic crisis has shown us, it's wealth and not income that allows people to weather financial crises. So if you have a really high income, but you lose your job and you have no savings or no wealth, you're in the same situation as the person, very low income, living paycheck to paycheck. Without savings, you really don't have that financial buffer if you lose your job because of unemployment or you have an illness. So people need wealth for financial security. So why should we care specifically about the women's wealth gap? Because some may wonder, and probably not a lot of people in this room, but I've encountered audiences where some have wondered why we should care so much about the women's wealth gap. Because don't most people marry, and then women and men, they pool resources, and not that it's not important, but maybe it matters less. Well, I want to go down some reasons why we should, even if that's the case, and I'll question that later in the talk, even if that's the case, why we should still care about it as a significant social issue. Well, first of all, at any one point in time, almost half of all households are non-married households. So right off the bat, we have about 50% of households who are non-married, so the gender wealth gap is going to be significant for a large percentage of people. We also know that marriage is not necessarily a forever institution. About half of all marriages end in divorce. And then if women even remain married, the financial protections of marriage will end for most women because women outlive their husbands, generally speaking. And I hate to tell some audience this, but widowhood is not a financial windfall for most women. So if that's your wealth gathering strategy, it might pay off, but it might not. In fact, a lot of research is showing that assets that married people accumulate during their time together are often spent down when there's a major illness, and it's usually the husband who has the major illness first. So by the time that he would pass, the household assets are far, far less than what they would have anticipated. Also, research is showing that not only are people divorcing and marrying later, all these factors contribute so that now adult women spend more of their lives single than they do married these days. And finally, the case is actually made that women need more wealth because they live on average longer. And so if you're going to support yourselves for more years in retirement, you actually need more wealth. So what am I going to do to look at this wealth gap? Well, I'm going to employ data from the 2007 Survey of Consumer Finances. Now, this is a triennial national survey that's sponsored by the Federal Reserve Board. They know how to measure wealth. The purpose of this survey is actually to look at wealth inequality. So they asked 1 million questions on every type of income and wealth and asset and debt that people might have, and they use that to track wealth inequality over time. But I do want to make a note that this data was collected just prior to the severe economic downturn. So what that means is that the picture that we get here is probably a rosier picture than what exists today. However, the general patterns are still likely to hold, and I can talk at the end if there are questions about what I expect to find when the new data is released. The 2010 data will be released this spring, so I can do an update. Just so that you know, my work focuses primarily on people under age 65. That was a practical reason. I was looking primarily at the relationship between income and wealth, which kind of shifts as people retire. But rest assured, these trends are there as well for people over age 65. I'm just not presenting the actual data here, but I have them on my website. And if you're especially curious, I can provide additional data at some point in the future. But the gist of what I'm pointing out here is that the data that I'm showing today are for 18 to 64, but the same patterns hold for older men and women. So the second part of my talk will also integrate information from interviews. And these are interviews that I did with 50 men and women of very diverse class and racial backgrounds, men and women, slightly more women than men. And I'll be drawing on them when we start to talk more about what happens in financial decision making within married and cohabitating households. And I can answer more questions as well about the data and all of that at the end if you're interested in all the nitty-gritty details. Okay, so what are we talking about here with respect to wealth? Well, this is just a simple chart that shows the median wealth by household type for people under age 65. So married and cohabitating couples are combined in green. Single men are in blue and single women are in pink. Now, single includes people who are never married, who are divorced, and who are widowed, and who are not cohabitating. Okay, so cohabitating people are in the green category. So you can see right away that couple households, whether they're married or cohabitating, have more wealth than either single men or single women. And there's many reasons for this. Some of the reason is because there's actually economies of scale that help people build more wealth. There's a lot of reasons. Wealthier or higher income people are more likely to marry. But what I really want to point your attention to right now is the gap between single men and single women. So the typical wealth, or the median wealth for single men under age 65 is just over $31,000. For single women, it's a little bit less than half of that at just over $15,000. So I want to point out as well that these wealth gaps between men and women, they hold up across age groups, they hold up across income categories, across levels of education. Essentially, any way I cut the data, when we're looking at things that we think would affect wealth, the gaps are still there. You know, they differ, sometimes they're less, sometimes they're greater, but they are always there. And they don't disappear when I control for these factors and many others, you know, in my regression models. So they're pretty persistent. So before I get to a few more nuances of the wealth gap, I just want to show you, I think, what is a very shocking statistic. And this is the percent of people in each category with zero or negative wealth. So there's a lot of different types of people in this group. People literally who have no savings, you know, no money in their pockets, or you know, or you could have people who have fairly high incomes but a lot of debt. So they have negative wealth. So this actually encompasses a broad range and types of financially able people. But when you look just at, you know, what is your sort of your financial bottom line, about a third of single women have zero or negative wealth. Okay, so that leaves them in a very financially precarious situation. And again, this was prior to the large economic downturn. So one of the things that I learned when researching this was that marital status really matters for women when we're looking at their wealth. And not just whether they're married, but have they ever been married, and are they divorced or are they widowed? So just to give you an idea of how that would matter, I've broken down the median wealth here for single men and single women according to whether they're never married, whether they're divorced or widowed. And you can see that there are differences. As you would expect, the never married women are generally younger than the divorced and the widowed women. And there are significant wealth gaps within each of those categories. So never married women have about $11,000 less than never married men in wealth. Divorced women about $22,000 less, and widowed women about $56,000. But if we convert this into a ratio of the median wealth for women compared to the median wealth for men, you would see here that never married women have only 2% or 2 cents for every dollar of wealth owned by never married men. Okay.
Sorry, I just don't understand that 210. That just seems so dangerously low. So it's a real number.
It's a real number. It's not a mistake. Actually, there were many times that I went back to the data thinking, there's something wrong here. The data is funky. You know, SPSS has gone wacko. Stata has gone wacko. Because I actually do a lot of similar analyses using both. But these numbers are real. But again, I think we have to think about what we're measuring here. So that $210 figure includes a lot of different types of people. This is the median. So the median is simply the point at which half have more and half have less. So there might be very high income earning women and men out there who have recently graduated from college with a lot of debt. Their wealth might be low. It doesn't mean that their incomes are necessarily low. But yes, this is a real number.
I have a clarification question on your previous slide.
Yeah.
Sorry to go back. Your cohabitating couples, I guess, does that include only heterosexual
No.
couples? It's anyone cohabitating?
Anyone cohabitating, yes. So single sex people are in that category as well.
I also have actually a question on the previous slide. That might be slightly different perspective, but does it include house debts? 'Cause
Yes.
I'm actually surprised that this is not worse.
Yes.
So, I mean, most Americans don't, so many Americans own their home, have a house.
Yes,
But 95% of those having a house don't own the house.
right, right.
So that's why I'm actually surprised that we don't see more negative wealth.
Right, and actually I think that we will when the new data comes out, because this was just prior to the downturn, and the house bubble hadn't quite burst yet. So I actually expect that a lot of the wealth here is artificially high because people are still thinking of their house being, what it was sort of in the last sort of housing boom. And I expect actually in the next data, we're going to see those housing numbers really drastically reduced. But you're right, because there are so many people who are, house poor, who are upside down in their mortgages, who've taken out so much against their house. But I'm glad that you think it's a good picture rather than a bad.
But, just the numbers I've
Yeah.
seen on household debt.
Right.
Makes me think, oh, that's actually not as bad.
Right.
You're right to say that it's 2007.
Exactly. And it's also including things like retirement debt. So, retirement assets. So you have the whole picture there. So most of their debt might be the house, but maybe they have other assets that somewhat compensate for that. But still, this is a zero or negative wealth. That's a huge, that's a low threshold. I think most people are not doing well. You're right. So I just also want to point out that the women's wealth gap is even worse for women of color. I don't think people will be surprised by that. I wish that I could tell you otherwise. And the data actually do not allow me to really disaggregate more than Black and Hispanic. They do not oversample other racial groups in this data set. So the numbers here for Black and Hispanic women show that Black women actually have a median wealth of 100, Hispanic women a median wealth of 120. What I think is also surprising, though, is that this racial wealth gap that we've heard so much about is striking, but there's also a gender component to it. So Black and Hispanic women have only a penny of wealth for every dollar of wealth that's owned by their same race, male counterparts.
I've seen some of this data before, and I was wondering, especially if we consider the fact that more Black women are going to colleges, is that student debt potentially?
Some of it is. I'm actually going to get to that at the end. So if I forget, will you raise that? Because that, I think, is a growing concern. But I will touch on that as we go on. And I would be remiss, of course, to not point out that mothers don't fare so well, especially mothers of color. Shockingly, Black and Hispanic women with children under 18 actually have a median wealth of 0. White women fare a bit better with a median wealth of almost $8,000, but white men with children have a median wealth of more than $56,000. So we can see right away, and not surprisingly, who the vulnerable segments of the population are. Primarily women of color, primarily women of color who are mothers. So when we're looking at wealth, and this might also answer some of the questions that you might be thinking of in terms of asset ownership, we need to also think about not just what your overall wealth looks like, but where is that wealth found? So that will give us clues. For instance, what should happen if the stock market booms or the housing market booms or busts? It might have differential impact on men and women depending on who owns what types of assets. So again, this is in 2007 here, and I'm just displaying the percentage of single men and single women who own each asset, not the median value. But I can tell you, in every single case, when you look at the median value of an asset if it's owned, women's median value is always less than men. But there's a couple of good things here, at least for women. They're slightly more likely to have cash accounts. So that's a very basic measure of financial ability, is to be sort of linked in with the financial system. In this data, they are slightly more likely to own their own home. Now again, when I look at 2010, I think that those numbers will go down because women have been disproportionately impacted by foreclosures as well. But this is good. Stock, women are less likely to own stock, which I think has important implications as well, and less likely to have business assets. So these are business assets that can be sold, which is different than owning your own business but not having assets. Okay. But one of my main points here is that we can't just look at what types of assets women own. We have to look at their debt as well. And here I've factored out the 4 most common forms of debt: home debt, education debt, credit card debt, and installment debt. And installment debt is just debt with regularly occurring payments, like a car loan. In every single category, single women are more likely to have each type of debt. They're more likely to have home debt, education debt, which is, I think, a huge one, and credit card debt. Now, you can see that almost half of all women have credit card debt, And they're not doing as well also with installment debt. They're more likely to have that. Education debt, I think, is of growing importance. We found out that, what was the recent figure? That last year, the number of student loans taken out, it crossed the 100 billion mark, I think, for the first time. So we see this burgeoning student loan debt problem. And I think it's going to have implications, not just for wealth inequality, but for the gender and racial wealth gap as well, because women are more likely now to attend college than men, and that's especially true for women of color. But women and people of color, and women of color in particular, are more likely to attend for-profit universities where they accumulate higher debt, and they're less likely to graduate with a degree. So they amass a lot of debt, they leave before they've completed their degree, and so they don't have the extra earning power of the degree, and yet they still have significant amounts of debt. So I think the whole student loan issue that we're just now starting to understand actually has tremendous implications, not just for our country and for wealth inequality, but the women's wealth gap and the racial wealth gap specifically. I saw a hand.
You answered it, actually.
Oh, okay.
When you said that women are more likely to attend for-profit universities and then leave without degrees, in comparison to, were you saying women of color in comparison to men of color?
No. Everyone who attends a for-profit university is less likely to graduate with a degree.
Got it.
Okay, so why? Why do we see these types of disparities that I've just outlined here? Well, I think probably the prime suspect would actually be the earnings gap. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I started to look at that, of course. Is it really just simply a byproduct of the earnings gap? If we fix the earnings gap, will the wealth gap disappear? So I think this is actually a wonderfully illustrative chart here. So overall, women earn about 78 cents to the dollar earned by men, and that has been very stable. It has not budged much of any over the past decade or two. But we can see some interesting differences between groups of women. So at the top, you have never married women, then divorced, widowed, and married. I don't know how well you can see this in the back. Okay, so if we look here at these different groups of women, you can see that never married women have essentially closed the wage gap. Actually, in the data, earning a median of $6 more. Okay, so we've seen these statistics in the news, and we think, woohoo, the wealth gap is over, the earnings gap is over, and actually many reasons why that's not the case, even if we see these numbers. But, so you can see that never married women, at least at this level, have closed the wage gap. Divorced women have about an 87% of the earnings of divorced men, widowed women 73%, and married women the lowest, with 72% of the incomes of married men. So what this tells me is if income were the cause of the wealth gap, or at least the significant cause, then we would expect that never married women would be doing fairly well. However, if you remember from the first chart, you saw that never married women still had a large gender wealth gap. I thought, well, maybe that's because we need to look just at full-time earners. So let's take full-time, people working full-time, never married, and let's see what their wealth gap looks like. Still not good at all. So this is the median wealth for never married people. Again, this is under age 65, but most of them are much younger than that, working full-time. The median wealth for never married men working full-time was $20,000. The median wealth for never married women working full-time was just $1,150. Okay. So this is a clue that income is probably not the only factor that's driving the women's wealth gap. In fact, what I'm arguing is that even if men and women had the same incomes, that women would still have less wealth, and there's two reasons for that. First is that women are more likely to have custody of children. Okay. So, same incomes, man and a woman, if a woman or whoever is supporting children on that income, two or more cannot live as cheaply as one. There's just simply going to be less money left over to save and invest. But that's not it either. That absolutely is important. But women are also less likely to have access to what I've termed the wealth escalator. So everybody wants to get on this wealth escalator. So what is it? Well, The wealth escalator are simply mechanisms that help you translate your income into wealth much more quickly. And I've identified 3 what I think are the most important, mechanisms or institutional factors that help people translate their income into wealth more quickly. The first is fringe benefits. The second is the tax code. And the third is the structure of government benefits. Now, these are all tied to employment, income, and marital status. And unfortunately, women just are not able to, because of the way they're structured, to benefit from them the same extent that men are. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over each of these different mechanisms. So first, fringe benefits. Those are the things that you are lucky to receive in addition to your regular pay from your employer. So paid sick days would be an example, employer-sponsored medical insurance or retirement benefits, stock options if you're really lucky. So all of these things, they can help you build wealth either directly, as if someone actually gives you money, like stock options, or employment contributions, retirement contributions to your 401k or your pension account. But there's also some that indirectly let you build wealth by providing things that you would ordinarily have to pay for. So paid sick days are an example. Employer-sponsored health insurance, life insurance. So things that you would want and would have to pay for otherwise. So there's an economic benefit to you. So women disproportionately work in jobs that are likely to come with fringe benefits. Women work disproportionately in service jobs, and those are the least likely of all types of jobs to provide any type of fringe benefits, even paid sick days. Women are also more likely to work part-time, and in most organizations, although not Harvard, part-time workers are ineligible for fringe benefits. And the tax code. What does that have to do with it? Well, the tax code, indirectly impacts the amount of money that you can hold on to, by how much you pay in taxes. So it's another really important mechanism here in a couple of ways. First, it provides lower tax rates on certain forms of income and wealth, like long-term capital gains. So at least the way that it's structured right now, if you have income from long-term capital gains, you pay a lower tax rate. Women are less likely to have the types of assets that receive the long-term capital gains rate, like stocks and investment real estate. And when they do, they have lower values of those assets, so they don't benefit to the same extent. The tax code also helps people indirectly build wealth by letting them defer taxes. So employer-sponsored retirement benefits, you're not paying taxes on the money that they're putting into your account until later after you retire, when hypothetically and hope you would have a lower income bracket, or sometimes you don't have to pay taxes at all. So even seemingly friendly sounding tax deductions, like the home mortgage interest deduction, for instance, benefits disproportionately wealthy people because their homes are worth higher values. And even though women are slightly more likely to own homes than men, as a 1 percentage point, I'd say it's pretty much equal, they're much less likely to be the wealthy homeowners. And government benefits, as I'm sure all of you will be aware, also contribute to women's ability to build or hold on to the wealth that they have. So public assistance, usually any type of need-based program has asset limits. And oftentimes people spend down or have to spend down any assets that they do have, including retirement benefits, in order to qualify. Even having a vehicle can sometimes disqualify you. In many states, if you have a vehicle that's worth more than $5,000, you're disqualified. But yet people, women, I'll be specific, but all people, if they have a vehicle that they need to get to work or to bring their children to daycare, it's much more economically beneficial for them to be able to hold on to that vehicle, have a reliable method of transportation, rather than having to sell that in order to qualify for assistance. So the problem with the need-based assets is not that we want to, of course, give everybody money who doesn't need money, but the problem is that when people have to really spend down all of their assets, essentially to zero, then it makes it much more difficult for them to land on their feet later on for the long term. But other government benefits like Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, they also impact women and men differently. So Social Security, for example, it's a gender-neutral program in the sense that it doesn't give you different benefits if you're a man or a woman. However, because of women's differential earnings levels and patterns of labor force participation, they often end up with lower Social Security benefits. So I've been talking a lot about the economic crisis, and it has impacted women's ability to build wealth. They've been very hard hit. Some studies have actually looked at differences in subprime mortgage rates. And as we know, this is a significant problem, and we're still feeling the effects of all of the subprime mortgage crisis. But studies are revealing that women are more likely to receive subprime loans, and this is true at every single income level. In fact, disparities actually increased as income increased. So at the highest income levels, women were 50% more likely to receive subprime mortgages than men. Now, the higher interest rates of these mortgages really then detract from women's ability to build wealth. So the authors of the study that found these gender differences did the calculations and said that if these women held these mortgages, for the full term of the loan, whether it was 15 or 30 years, they would have paid somewhere between $85,000 and $186,000 more for the mortgage. And the saddest part is that many of these people, men and women, who received these subprime mortgages, they could have qualified for conventional mortgages, but they were disproportionately targeted and not, I guess, offered, the best product, and either didn't know enough or didn't know they had options to actually qualify for conventional mortgages. So we're still seeing the effects, because with the subprime mortgages, people are much more vulnerable to foreclosure as well. And something that's not also often pointed out with the whole unemployment rate is that the unemployment rate for women who maintain families has been high. It's always been higher, but it's been very high during the recession. It reached a high of 13.4% in July 2010. And the most recent data that I have for September was that the unemployment rate for women who maintain families was 12.4%. This is in September, whereas the average unemployment rate was 9.1%. So these are just data that's sort of lost kind of in the shuffle of looking at unemployment. And to make matters worse, now I feel like I'm like a doomsday prophet. Often women are less likely to qualify for unemployment benefits. For a variety of reasons. And again, it has to do with their types of labor force participation. So it varies by state, but in some states, part-time workers are ineligible for unemployment insurance. In some states, if you have to change shifts, it's required that you change shifts, but you can't find childcare for your new shift, you don't qualify for unemployment insurance. So there's lots of issues that women are more likely to face that make it so that they're often less likely to qualify.
So this is very interesting. I had no idea about this. So is it not true that men were hit harder by the economic crisis than women? Because the conventional argument has been that it was the industries where men typically work, such as construction, manufacturing, etc., which were hit hardest in the financial sector, and not healthcare and education. And that's where the conclusion then derived that it actually was men who were overproportionately hit by the economic crisis.
The man session, they called it. And actually, at the beginning of the recession, it was primarily industries where men were more likely to work, like construction, let's say, and finance. So men were hit hard at the beginning. But then there was this trickle effect. And we're still seeing it now, where women are actually more likely to lose their jobs, because now it's hitting the public sector. And so, nurses, teachers, the types of jobs that women are more likely to have are experiencing the greater cuts. So it was a man session at first. And then it started to be a woman session. But I don't know, media lost interest, I'm not sure. But the women's session part wasn't covered to the same extent as the man session.
Sorry, you might have covered this, but why exactly is it that women are more likely to receive subprime loans?
That's an excellent question. I think they're still trying to pack that out, because it's not necessarily because of credit score or income. They think it's because they were targeted. Specifically, communities of color and women were targeted by subprime lenders. Nobody's forcing people, to sign on the dotted line, but I think that they have very sophisticated selling techniques. I think that as a country, we're not as financially educated as we should be. So I don't want to blame people, because I think they were targeted, but I think there's a lot of reasons that they're still trying to unpack.
I think beyond being just as a country we're not financially educated, but particularly women, are less financially educated? And is there a particular explanation for that?
Let me hold that question until we get to the gender stuff. I mean the household gender stuff. Everybody needs to be better financially educated, myself included. Women are more likely to think that they are not as good at math and not as good at finances than men. And so they're more likely to think that they can't do it or they shouldn't do it. They're more likely to give the responsibility to someone else. Interestingly, research shows that women are very good at it. But I'll save some more comments until we move on. Okay. So before I move on to the marriage part, I just want to emphasize the reasons why women have less access to the wealth escalator. It's because, a lot of the reason is because of the types of jobs they have. Non-unionized, service-based, they're in jobs that are least likely to offer wealth escalating benefits. Patterns of labor force participation, part-time labor force participation, taking time out of the labor force, for caregiving or other reasons, all of those impact your income and hence your ability to tap into these wealth escalating benefits. So if you're working part-time or not at all, you're not getting any employer contributions to any kind of retirement accounts, for instance. Women are more likely to have custody of children. I think we can all imagine the effect that would have on your wealth. And if not, I can tell you, even as a married person, has a really bad effect on your wealth. So children are just very expensive. And the debt anchor. Now, I didn't talk so much about this, but women have higher interest rates on their loans. Not just mortgage loans, but also in their credit cards and everything. So women are carrying around not just more debt, as we saw from the debt chart, but also higher interest rates on the debt that they do have. Okay. Yes?
So when you talk about are carrying higher interest rates, there are places in the world where one can legally make a higher interest rate for one class versus another class. But what you're talking about here, in essence, is a voluntary gap, so to speak, in that people sign up for a particular credit card or a mortgage.
Right.
But that as a group, women are carrying more.
Exactly. And I'd like to see more research to see exactly why that is. Is it because they're making poorer financial decisions? Is it because they have more dings on their credit report, let's say, although that didn't seem to be the case with the mortgage, but you could imagine it with the credit cards, especially these days now with all the tightening. If you don't have a perfect credit card or a perfect credit history or record, you get higher interest rates on your credit cards.
In that same vein, is there any research to show that credit card companies or other lenders are actually aggregating lists of, this is a woman, we'll send her a credit card with a 13% interest rate? Is there any evidence to suggest that people are being targeted in that way?
I don't know. I don't know. I would think they would be sly.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I just don't know. I'm going to have to punt that. Okay. So going back to that first chart that I showed at the beginning with the green bar with couples having a lot of wealth and single people having the least, that could raise some flags. And actually I worried about this when I first started to put my research out there. Is some really, really ultra conservative think tank going to get a hold of this and say that all women should get married? And this will solve all of their financial problems. I don't think it's happened yet, but I still worry about it. Just because when you look at that information, you think, well, everybody should get married then. This is God's will. That married people should be wealthy. I mean, you could just imagine, I guess the trajectory that this could take. So, but even so, I mean, is marriage, does that really improve women's financial situation? Not necessarily that everybody should get married, but does it really impact financial situation positively? Because we have to understand these dynamics. So this is where I'm going to bring in the interview data. To shed light on how couples treat marital or combined assets. I'm going to say married couples in the interviews, but I actually had many cohabitating couples and also many same-sex couples in the interviews. So I'm just going to treat them all as the same category. So is this the answer then? Should people be marrying or the equivalent? So you could imagine when you're thinking about how people are treating their couple finances, at one end of the spectrum you might have sort of the outdated, original, sort of traditional notion of man being the head of the household, and that he would just sort of by default make the financial decisions because he's considered the financial and major decision maker of the household. And at the other end of the spectrum, you could imagine sort of the complete joint model where couples come together every evening or once a week or once a month and talk about their finances and make all their decisions together. Well, I'm sure there are models of each of those, but most couples, I'd say 99% of the couples that I talked to did something totally different. Okay, so they didn't do either one of those methods. What they did are one of two things. The first is what I've called voluntary specialization. And so in this method of financial decision making, the couples perceive that the resources are jointly owned, but one person has the responsibility for managing them. So it could look like sort of the traditional arrangement, where one person has most of the control, but it's not automatically just sort of de facto the husband that has control. The wife can also be the one to be the main financial decision maker. So in explaining why people chose to do this method, they chose based on differences in abilities, preferences, or experiences. And all of these are, in theory, gender blind. So I heard reasons like, well, I'm just much better at math, or he or she is more interested in financial topics. He or she had much more money than I did before we got married and is more used to handling it, et cetera, et cetera. So if men and women were equally likely to have these types of preferences and abilities, then we would see that, in roughly half the cases, women would be the financial decision makers, and in roughly half the cases, men would be the financial decision makers. So, in theory, this is a rational and gender-blind way of deciding, who's going to manage the finances. But, as social scientists, one of the things that we learned is that our ideas and our preferences are not so de facto. They're shaped by our socialization, our cultural experiences, and not surprisingly, financial decision-making falls into that category as well. So, as one woman in her 30s explained to me, and this was kind of a typical response when I probed more deeply about why people made a decision regarding who was going to manage finances. She said, I don't remember my parents sitting down and teaching my brother and not teaching me, but he just picked up on it. It just wasn't something in my little internal toolbox. My gut feeling is that a lot of men really do have that internal toolbox. I think they get it from society. I think on some level he must have felt, and my husband feels this way too, that he needs to be responsible for money because he's a man. So, in thinking about this voluntary specialization model, well, first I want to point out that it wasn't always men who were the financial decision makers. Women were also sometimes in the category of being the financial decision maker. And interestingly enough, it seemed that it had to do more with level of education. When there's a big educational difference between men and women, I saw that women were more likely to assume that task.
Did you find that most of the couples did have all of their assets pooled and considered as joint assets?
No.
What did that look like?
I'll show you in just a second. Yeah, that's the next model. That's the next model.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's some evidence on developing countries that says that there is actually more often the women who's taking over the financial decisions. And if I remember correctly, that was also true for kind of low-income households in the U.S.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. In low-income households, women are oftentimes more likely to do the financial tasks. But, there's an important distinction here when we're talking about, finding enough money to pay the bills, versus really, thinking about, retirement planning and sort of managing assets. And what some research has shown is that when the money management is very stressful, as it is when you don't have enough money to pay the bills, women are more likely to assume the tasks. When it's, maybe stressful isn't the right word, but when there's more wealth involved, then men are more likely to assume the tasks. And that's a really interesting gender divide. Okay, yes.
Yeah, it's, I feel that I really assume when men control the money, they control the woman and everything in it, and they really abuse the money and they abuse everything. So I think women are so responsible for the money management and that.
Actually, I'm going to talk about the power differentials that are involved there. this method of sort of delegation of financial tasks, it might never be experienced by either person as a power differential. Because if you think about it hypothetically, if both people are enjoying the discretionary income, are enjoying, the assets, then does it really matter, who is managing them? I mean, it might not ever really matter. It might not ever really be experienced as a power differential. But in a worst case scenario, that pattern has some significant disadvantages. One partner can hide assets. There's a whole show devoted to divorce, financial, what do they call it? Forensic accountants. In high-profile, high-net-worth divorce cases, if one person thinks that somebody has hidden assets, they bring in the financial sleuths to figure out where those assets might be. So this actually happens a lot if you believe the TV show. But also, it can really, it can leave one person in the dark. So it can mask a bad financial situation. And this is more of what I've seen. And both spouses are responsible for debt that's acquired during marriage. So it doesn't matter if you didn't know about it, or if it wasn't your TV or your whatever, you're both responsible.
Can I say something? I just want to say, fraudulent conveyance was my first topic of legal research. I know so much about it. Fraudulent conveyance is a state thing, not a federal thing. Fraudulent conveyance is, it's against the law, and the one person that can put it back right, not necessarily transfer the assets back right, but the one person who cannot be legally deceived by the any fraudulent transfer is the intended defrauding. So, for example, I own stock. The man owns stock in a company. He transfers the stock to his business partner because a divorce is pending. No, so the intended defraudee is the wife, and so only for the wife the intended transfer is null and void. But for everyone else, the business partner now has the assets. It's very, and there are 5 standards of what 5 clues as to what determines a fraudulent conveyance.
And I mean, women can deceive as well. So it's not just men. But the point is that if one person has control over all the assets, then you could imagine that this type of fraud, could happen, especially if you think there's a divorce pending or other, bad situation. But even if, let's say, there's no ill will, people aren't deliberately trying to fraud, their partners or their soon-to-be ex-spouses, there's a latent disadvantage to this method, and this is more likely to impact women. And that is that, as we know, marriage is going to end. Either through divorce or through widowhood. And women are more likely to outlive their husbands. So they will be thrown into the financial waters sort of at a time when they're most vulnerable and stressed, so at the time of divorce or widowhood. So that's really not the best time to try to gear up on all your financial decision making. Okay, so what's this other method? The other method is what I called the voluntary separation, or the separate checks please method. And under this arrangement, couples devise strategies to meet their joint expenses, but then they also control their own money. So they do this in a variety of ways. Some contribute half or equally to every joint expense. Others contribute in proportion to their income. So they devise strategies that seem fair and seem reasonable, so that each person has control over their own money, but yet they're still contributing to common expenses. And couples explained that this was really critical for minimizing conflict, because as long as all the joint expenses were being met, if he wants to spend his money on this and she wants to spend her money on that, there's no complaining on either side, because it's their money that they can spend as they wish. And oftentimes, couples were also guided actually by goals of simplification and fairness. They thought this was a very fair way, to devise their strategies. So, couples, again, I'll go through the pros and cons, but this might, again, never be experienced as, disadvantage. But this can also be taken to an extreme, and I'll just give you an example that came up in the research. Now, there was a married couple, Glenn and Stephanie. They were married for 14 years. They were married sort of later in life, and so they had each been used to managing their own finances, and that's another contributing factor. If you've been on your own for 5, 10, 15 years, you're used to managing your own stuff. So their arrangement was that they would each contribute to joint expenses 50-50. And she was working as a receptionist, he was an accountant, and this worked really well for them for about 12 years. Then Stephanie's mother became ill with Alzheimer's, and she cut back her work to part-time so that she could help provide care for her mother. And she felt very, very fortunate to do that. But she kept contributing half to the joint expenses, and her income now was cut in half. So as a result, she incurred quite a bit of credit card debt. And she explained to me, she said, I did get into a jam with the credit cards, not to the point that I couldn't use them any longer, but my payments on a monthly basis were so much for so many different credit cards that it was ridiculous. To make a long story short, I got a consolidation loan, and because I was part-time, I had to get someone to co-sign, and my husband did co-sign, and he was fine with that. Now, she acknowledges that she could have asked to modify the terms, that her husband could have actually afforded to give her the money or lend her the money to pay off the credit card debt, but she didn't want that. She explained to me that she wanted to continue to participate as a financial equal in the marriage, and that for her, that was very important, to be financially equal, to be financially independent. So she did not want to modify the terms of their agreement. So, there are absolutely benefits to this system of management. Each person has financial independence, it seems to minimize conflict, and it also recognizes formally women's economic contributions to the household. However, there's some financial inequities that the system can often mask as well. So the lower earning partner almost always ends up with less discretionary income. If they're contributing 50-50, if you have lower earnings, you're going to have less left over. Even if you contribute in proportion, you might contribute less as the lower earning partner, but because you have lower earnings, you have less left over. So there's a hidden financial inequity there, but also spouses might not know very much about the finances of the other person. So one woman in her late 50s, she was talking about how important it was for her to save for retirement because she really wanted to make sure that she and her husband had a secure retirement. And I said, oh, is your husband saving for retirement? And she said, I don't know. I really don't know. I hope he is. So, she didn't know, and their fates are sort of intermingled. So this is all my way of getting back to why marriage might not be the solution. All else being equal, married women and men are wealthier. If marital resources are shared and kind of co-owned, then women generally end up with higher resources than if they were single. But this does not mean that marriage is the solution to any types of financial inequities. As the interviews point out, I think rather nicely, we can't necessarily assume that all wealth is owned or managed equally. It might be the case in some couples, but not necessarily in all. Also, if we go by the de facto rules of marriage, it would leave out same-sex couples. And now we get to the power differential. If women's access to wealth is primarily through marriage, they actually have less power in the marriage. This has been shown, there's lots of economic models that show this, because they know that if the marriage ends, they're much more vulnerable. So they're more likely to give in when conflicts arise and any types of power struggles take place, because they know that if the marriage ends, they cannot support themselves as well outside of marriage. Also, the potential wealth benefits of marriage are not equal for all groups of women. If we rely on marriage as the answer to the women's wealth gap, women of color, Black and Hispanic women in particular, will not reap the same economic benefits as white women, because people tend to marry others of the same race, not always, and there's such high racial wealth-based inequality that women of color are more likely to marry men of color. They're not going to get the same wealth boost as white women will from marrying. And finally, women actually face a demographic challenge in remaining married throughout their lives, because as they age, with the differential death rates, The potential marriage partners keep shrinking every year as women grow older. There's fewer and fewer marriage partners, if you're assuming that people marry others of roughly similar age. So there's a demographic challenge. Women just cannot stay married until they die.
I think you might want to add a variable to that list that you mentioned earlier, which is maybe the most important one, and that is that marriage is not causal, right? We're not dumping randomly marriages and some people are not on others, and therefore we can show the impact of marriage. But as you said earlier, the wealthy, highly educated are more likely to marry.
Right.
So the causality may well go the other way around. So
exactly.
Therefore, any group that might ever want to steal and misinterpret, it's just really very stupid, because it's not an exogenous instrument that you can dump on people and then things will happen.
You're right. I should make that very clear, because I don't want this PowerPoint slide to be usurped. But yes, it's true. Higher income people are more likely to marry. Higher educated people are more likely to marry. And just sort of as a sidebar, this has really interesting implications, I think, for higher educated women, because they have higher earnings, hence higher wealth building potential. But when they marry, they're also the ones that can most afford to step out of the labor market. So you have an interesting dynamic, I think, going on there. Yeah.
And also, since your grouping here isn't actually married, it's cohabitating.
Right.
You may wish to think about the term partnered. Because I think marriage, because it has all kinds of implications, also a set of tax implications. I'd be interested if you disaggregated the within this married group, and if you found that there were any sort of differences that bore out if you looked at married versus cohabitating.
In terms of how they manage the money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Within the group, how the wealth disaggregates, since we already know
right.
that women aren't going to stay married through the arc of their life.
Right.
And, great knowledge here that the majority of their life will be spent unmarried.
Right.
Right. So what does it really mean?
Right.
Are there differential sort of findings in that group?
Yes. I know, I'm looking for my pen. I want to write these down. So yeah, that's thank you. That's a great idea.
Sorry, and I was also interested in the previous slide where you showed the various different financial models that companies use, and I was really interested to hear what if there was any wealth repercussions from that. Like, did one model result in women ended up having slightly more wealth, albeit like less than men?
Right.
Between the two different financial models, which one are women more well off in?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I have a second book. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you thought at all about policy implications regarding regarding laws, differentiation in laws. There was a talk, I guess, last week here by an economist at the World Bank who looked at the ways in which legal differentiation impacts workforce participation. And
so when you mean legal differentiation?
so one of the comments you had made a number of slides back was that certain laws treated women and men in this country the same,
right.
but that could have a negative impact on women's ability to acquire wealth.
Right.
And what the economist, I forget her name, maybe somebody here remembers.
Rita Ramalho.
Thank you. What she had said is that she had found, I believe, correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrongly, but that in some cases, having differential laws, even if they were meant to help women's participation in the workforce, could actually backfire for various reasons. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about your results at all in terms of policy implications regarding benefits for men and women.
Right. I think that the best approach is to do the gender neutral, but then level the playing field in certain ways so that it's not disproportionately going to have a negative impact on a certain group. And I'll give some examples, actually, in a slide or two. Okay, so at this point in the talk, usually people are asking me or asking questions themselves. What can we do? What types of suggestions or solutions would you have? And these are macro level things that I'm going to talk about here more so than what an individual woman can do with her own finances. we can talk about more as well as a discussion. I wanted to keep it brief in the interest of time, so I'm going to highlight a couple here. But of course, there's many, many more. I mean, systemic change has to take place, so there's not one or two just simple solutions that can be offered. So the first, I think, important change that needs to be made is that we need to incorporate caregiving into the wealth escalator. So what might that look like? So I outlined some of the ways that caregivers are sort of structurally disadvantaged in accumulating wealth. And it happens to be disproportionately women because women are disproportionately the caregivers. So one approach would be to incorporate caregiving better into the wealth escalator so that we don't see this detrimental impact to the same extent. So a couple of examples. Social Security benefits. I mean, right now, when you leave the labor market or you have reduced earnings, those impact your highest 35 years of taxable income. So those will bring down your average benefit. There's nothing like a couple years of zero earnings or even low earnings to really bring down your average benefit. And if you think about it, 35 years of taxable earnings, that's pretty much from the time you graduate from college, or if you get an advanced degree, definitely until the time you retire. So there's not very much time in there for the highest 35 years to have a lot of years of lower earning years. Caregiving. So other countries have instituted what they call the caregiver credits for Social Security. So if you're either out of the labor market because of caregiving, and it's not just children, it's spouses or elderly parents, any type of caregiving, that you're given credits so that your average benefits are not just reduced so dramatically. A couple of other sort of real-life examples. A lot of the tax deductions that are geared towards families with children, and we know these are disproportionately likely to be women-headed families, are tax credits like the child tax credit and the dependent care tax credits. But a lot of low-income families and a lot of single mothers don't qualify for them because their incomes are too low. So if they were refundable, this would be another way, I guess, of helping to ease that burden. But also things like paid sick days that we're finally hearing a lot of attention being paid to, and parental leave are also critical. I mean, the U.S. is one of only 2 industrialized countries without a national paid maternity leave system. Australia is the other one. In contrast, 47 developing countries have at least 12 weeks of paid maternity leave at 100% of wages. Hanging that out there, because that's a serious discrepancy. Okay, but also there's cultural and social shifts that we need to be paying attention to in addition to policy. And so I think probably 2 of the most important here are, first, that we need to continue to engage men in caregiving as equal partners. I see evidence of that. I think men are more engaged in caregiving than they ever were. You see men, at the bus stop and, at doctor's appointments and things like that. But it's still, it's not equal. But I think that until men are just as involved in caregiving, the caregiving issues will always be seen as a woman's issue. Okay? And that's just detrimental to any issue to be labeled a woman's issue, politically and socially. So I think we need to continue to engage men as allies, and men want to be there. If you look at research, men want to be in their children's lives. They want to be engaged more. But also, we have to address the cultural message that gender inequality is a result of individual choices. So choices to choose one job or field of study over another, choices to have children or not, choices to get married or not, choices to cut back your working hours. Are these choices? Absolutely, but they are socially embedded. They're structured by who we think should be doing what at what particular time, and each of these different choices is assigned differential value. So we don't value caregiving to the same extent that we value other activities. We don't reward it economically. We see mothers as less capable, let's say. I mean, studies have shown that when people have identical resumes, and the only thing that's different is that the woman is a mother, she's offered lower starting salaries. So everything else is the same. So we have cultural stereotypes about, and this is men and women, so it's not just the men that are making the decisions, women do too. We have cultural stereotypes about women and about mothers that make them what we think less valuable in the workforce. So these are deep-rooted, and we all have them. Okay, so when you leave this room, what do I hope you remember? I hope you remember just really 3 things that I think are the corner. the cornerstone. First is that we have to look at wealth inequality. It's distinct from wealth than income inequality, and it's much, much greater. Wealth is more important for economic stability, and as we've seen, there are inequities that are hidden when we look at income, that when you look at wealth, they just stand out. The situation of never married women in particular. And second, and I didn't talk about this as much, but we can talk about this in the Q&A as well, whether it's a result of differences in marriage rates or because of earlier ages of widowhood, women of color are more likely to be single. If women continue to experience a wealth gap, the racial wealth gap cannot close. The other thing that I think you'll remember is that a women's wealth gap would remain even if men and women had the same incomes. Okay, so of course we want to close the wage gap, but that's not going to end it there. We would still see a wealth gap because women are more likely to be custodial parents and because they lack access to the wealth escalator. So people have accused my talks of being depressing. I do not see it that way. So in closing, what I want to say is that some of the statistics are a little bit depressing, but I actually see them as a source of inspiration. And that's how I'm hoping that you'll take them as well. So thank you very much.